and cities, right? Basically, it comes down to three main factors that caused the attack or the explosion in Chernobyl. And this is what all the researchers come up with, right? Why did it explode? Technology failure, technology procurement failure, more specifically. I'm going to go into what exactly that means and what that meant then. Process and procedures. They were doing a special test of the reactor. During those test conditions, the material they bought was not actually built for those test conditions. And they didn't have the right procedures and processes during that test. And that led to a human error. These are kind of things you'll probably hear within the smart cities context, and I'll come back to why these are still relevant. But we'll go with Chernobyl first, right? That's what the PowerPoint's talking about. So this is basically a schematic of what happens in a nuclear power plant, right? So you have water that's used to both cool the core and to generate fission in order to generate steam, in order for there to be electricity at the end of it. Importantly, the Russian nuclear power plants were built with these two main components, very essential to what happened in the incident. 211 control rods made with boron going into graphite moderator, up and down, controlling the temperature of the fission, controlling the temperature of everything that's happening, controlling the whole operations of the plant. They needed to be in good control, obviously, just like you have to have good control of anything, but the consequences of losing control were quite dramatic there, right? So, clicker's not clicking. Here's where we're going to do some multitasking. You're going to do some multitasking. So this is where I want to do the correlation between 1986, those three factors, and a film from Hollywood, 2015, showing in a very advanced attack, which never happens. But there's a correlation anyway at the end of it. So the film, you can see there's Hollywood style. Some hacker has made his way in to a network. Bing, there's a little eye on the network. Soon we're going to see the hacker here, right? So this is the guy who's hacking his way into some kind of system. He's going to press enter after he's done smoking his cigarettes here in a little bit, and he's going to hack the system. You're going to see a bunch of little white boxes after he presses enter here. That's to symbolize that he's in, right? I talked about the first factor at Chernobyl. I'm now going to go into the other factors. This is where multitasking comes in. The women are probably better than the men, but we'll deal with that, right? So factor number 2 was policies and procedures weren't followed in Chernobyl when it exploded. Those rods that I talked about, which we'll soon see here, rods again, 211 of them, 28 of them were supposed to be in contact with the reactor at all times. Yet when the explosion happened, only 11 were in the actual contact with the graphite moderator. So here we can see code hacking its way into the system. We have a fan behind the fan here. When it explodes, the fan goes off, you'll see control rods. So we have a nuclear power plant that's being hacked here. So point number 2, people and processes during this test, they were not following the procedures, right? And maybe even the procedures were wrong because they were not really built for that test. So that brings me over to the third factor, which was a human error. When they noticed, you'll see a blip, or maybe the blip already happened, I might have missed it on the system here. When they indicated their first early warning in Chernobyl that something was going wrong, someone pushed manual emergency stop, which of course meant that the fission rate was completely out of whack, the temperatures rose, everything blew up. So those three factors are just as relevant, as I'll show you shortly, 1986 in a nuclear power plant as they are for any system that you're trying to control even today. And unfortunately, we often just bring things to market, give it to end customers, and let them deal with it without really companies like Fortinet here, who are able to help much more further along the way in actually deploying systems. We saw a good DevOps build from picture from Kim earlier. And Axis tries to work in those same life cycle approach, and we'll come into that. So again, the three factors are important, but before, how likely is this ever to happen, right? So people who are actually working with cybersecurity, cyber experts, they're just waiting for the smart cities of Chernobyl to happen. You can actually Google that term. You'll see on YouTube people saying that, right? And if you talk about the Department of Homeland Security, They see a terrorist attack being the next major, or being a cyber attack being the next major terrorist attack. So I don't mean to scare, but this is reality. We saw your evolution curve Kim showed as well. We're very early in things like 5G. I would say we're very earlier in cities, smart cities. And maybe we're not really that mature in how we actually manage a smart city. Something as vast as a smart city is quite big and a lot of responsibility. So it's a lot to think about. And these three factors are quite important because in a security context, they're actually top down. Human errors, 95% of all cybersecurity attacks are based in human errors. It's not the system as such, it's the person not really knowing what to do with it. Because point two is policies and procedures. So traditionally, a security system, an IT system is built with set it and forget it. Put it on an isolated network. Don't deal with it if you don't have to. But that's not viable anymore. And I'm going to go into why a bit later. And then it's the technology procurement, right? So they procured graphite, was interacting with boron. They had to have a certain balance in order to be able to control it in a good way. But if I took away boron and graphite with cameras or any other kind of sensor, software, these things are vulnerable. We heard about it. There are vulnerabilities in systems. Any system, anything you put on the network is vulnerable. There is no magic. There are firewalls, there are VPN networks, but even that is not enough. And I'll go into why. So the same risks that we saw in Chernobyl are the same for any system that you deploy in a city or in an enterprise environment or a restaurant, wherever you put it. But if you go back to cities, right? Where are we with cities today and smart cities, and where's it going? So the UN talks about 68% of the world's population will be living in urban areas, 2050. COVID might have slowed that number down a little bit. People are maybe rethinking things slightly, but there's been no change in that number since then. So all this means that all these people with all these devices, their own devices and devices that are out in the city, it's all there, right? There's a lot of data, and there's a lot of devices, and there's a lot of people coming into an area on a network. And however you protect that network, it's going to be vulnerable one way or the other anyway. Why is this happening? How did this happen? So I'm going to show some old slides here from 1990 all the way up to 2017. What's happened with the growth of internet, right? And we all know that. It's taken for granted. This is stopping in 2017, where we see in the Nordic countries, this is 96%. Whoop, sorry. 96% of people had internet access in 2017. I hope I didn't break your thing there, Linus. And same in Canada, right? We'll see if it's broken. But internet access isn't enough if you want to live in a smart city. If you want to have a smart city, you have a good enterprise network. You need high-speed internet access, right? If we look at the same data starting from 98 to 2017, we'll see the numbers in the Nordics. Leave that down. Around 45% in the Nordics, 2017. We're probably up closer to 60%. Maybe Henrik, maybe you know, maybe other people know the number. But we're not at 100% anymore, we're not at 96. We're getting closer to where we are with the slide before. And again, as Kim pointed out, it's because of 5G and the promise of 5G. And if you look at the other Gs and what they promised, 2G was like SMS and texting. I remember that was like a big thing, right? But now we're at 5G, where that's real-time data analysis and processing so that cities can be smart. They can get data in real time and do something with it, take decisions. And that's the same with buildings and homes, right? So I talk about cities, but I think we saw some slides about how you can split up a 5G network in different environments. It's not just cities. 5G is going to bring a lot of change because of the internet power and the network power, which makes us think about all those things that are connecting to the internet from an access perspective, right? And everyone's probably seen this slide or something similar before. 75 billion connected devices by 2025. Lots of stuff is getting onto the net. But last year alone, 3.2 billion breaches of IoT devices. A 300% increase year on year. That's a problem, right? And I'll come back to one of the issues up behind that problem, but that's last year, reality. But the good news is, cities, for example, are going to have connected citizens using connected devices, laptops, all kinds of stuff. to get better services. And what are those services about? And what's the purpose behind the services? And how are they working today? So this slide is showing a bunch of different types of services. So first responder, that's like emergency. You're calling up, I'm trying to think of the Swedish word. Emergency services. We're trying to get someone to help someone who's ill or whatever. Air quality, traffic, and how the flows of traffic are working in the cities. How the police, and you'll see we have different balls here, right? So I have police here and there. The police force here is working on its own isolated silo network. And even their HQ is not directly always connected with them seamlessly. And it's even further the further out we go in terms of how a city defines what its services are. A lot of these services are more private today than they were public before I came to Sweden. But they're moving together. And the internet and 5G and things are helping that happen. And the result, we're going to be connecting lots of endpoints, different types of sensors, so cities can make smarter, more informed, safer decisions for the citizens living in it. It all sounds wonderful. Of course, if we look at that curve of evolution where we are, we're quite early. There's some interesting experiments in H2 here, H22, in other cities in Sweden, all around the world. You can go out and check them out. I've seen a couple. Really nice looking stuff happening. But is it all good news? If I come back to that question. Because where we are today, interconnectivity is changing the game. 90% of all IoT attacks are made through things like routers and connected cameras. So anything you put on a network is a potential entry point for malicious attacks, for vulnerabilities, for interconnectivity, and for the most important layer, the human layer, who they have to deal with all these devices, whether you're a private citizen or you're working in a city. They're the users of the system, right? And again, on the evolutionary curve, we're quite early. So interconnectivity is changing the game. We're getting more information, but it's also exposing a lot more vulnerabilities out there. At the same time, I've talked about perimeter defense before, no longer being viable. I can't just put everything on a network, isolate that network, think it's going to work forever. Static is not the way to progress in life or in networking, right? So 56% of all data breaches are actually malicious insider attacks. People within the company, within the city, doing something maliciously, probably not, most of the times not intentionally, unintentionally, but they're the root of the cause. And of course you can pick up a USB stick here and stick it in all kinds of places, but who knows what you've put into that USB stick, right? So you can't really think about, you can just put something out there and leave it unprotected, it's going to be fine just because it's isolated. That's not a truth. And then the biggest thing is actually coming back to supply chains. So supply chain attacks last year, 430% rise in that. I'm going to spend a bit more time on what that means. But that means everything from hardware processors stealing information from your memory to malicious hardware or software inserted after the OBDEPS model. People stopping stuff into the logistics flow, distribution flow, for example. There's always bugs, hijacking, phishing, and then there's even backdoors in devices we've heard about as well. So all these are supply chain attacks, not the end customers or the cities themselves, but the vendors involved in supplying to those customers. So show of hands here. Everybody up with a hand. Who has an iPhone or an Android? Who has leave them up, that was good. Who has updated firmware that knows 100% your iPhone or your Android, or let's take your laptop or your pad, it's running the latest firmware. Keep your hands up, right? If you're uncertain, bring it down. Second step, how many of you use this? Hold them up again, come on. How many of you use for that iPhone the same password that you use for your computer that you use for anything else? For all the apps on your iPhone, do you use the same password? We got one guy here. Great, so we got a leader in making sure passwords are a very big issue we heard before. I'll come back to it. But most people in the evolution of mankind, I have like one password for everything. I'm just great, I can remember that. That's the way most people work. So what's the cost? What's the potential cost of cybercrime to the global economy? And these are numbers that are out there. You can Google them. You can find them yourself. Going back to 2016, it was 450 billion US dollars. I'm talking US dollars here. Going up to 2021, it's now at $6 trillion. And going forward, you can see the number there. So this is huge money, right? It's unfathomable what it really means. $6 trillion. I can use a bit of that to help my house renovation projects, but if I'm trying to put it into context, right, $6 trillion is 30% of America's GDP in total. So 30% of their gross domestic product is at risk thanks to cybercrime. That sort of puts you in perspective, right? We're here in Helsingborg, kind of a smaller city in comparison to all of America's GDP, but that same 30% is probably still relevant here as it was there. So it's huge amounts of money. And where does the implications of a cyber attack, what's it based in? So an operational disruption, you can no longer operate your city or your enterprise organization or your ice cream store or your gas station, whatever it is, you can't work anymore because today, businesses, cities, it's data that they're working on. Data is what's powering operations. We talk about OT, IT, but it's data, really, that is the driver. So what happens if someone steals your data? It gets lost. Or someone's using it to leak as a ransom attack method, perhaps. You're going to pay money, right? You're going to lose money as the enterprise or the city. And if it's tied up with your IP, as data is all around your IP, whether it's about a product or whether it's about an experience in a city, for example, you have that written down somewhere. That's data. And if someone can jeopardize, you're in trouble, right? And that's going to lose to reputational damage within the city and within the country or within the enterprise and within the industry. And thanks to GDPR, you get fined. And I'll come into that pretty soon, what that means and what's happening there. So if we look just at last year alone, 4 main keys in the cyber attack methods that are out there, lots of vectors, of course. These are the 4 I chose to pick on. These companies and organizations we're going to show some examples of. Supply chain, ransomware, Internet of vulnerable things, and then how legislation's fighting back. So the supply chain attack, it's basically a bad guy trying to extort money from an end customer via the supply chain. That's a quick definition of what a supply chain attack is. So SolarWinds, I don't know if anyone's heard of SolarWinds. They are an American company that develops software for business to help manage their network systems and information technology infrastructure. That's what they write themselves. That's what they do. So they're an IT company. They suffered the largest, most sophisticated supply chain attack ever last year. The attack was actually able to make the way into the network, access 18,000 end user data files, never to be heard from again. The same happened to Log4j. So I don't know if anyone's heard of Log4j. It's a Java-based component that's common to many Apache services globally. Someone hacked their way into that component of a software system. The consequences are in the billions of dollars. These companies are probably going to have a hard time in the next few years at least. And it's not just these 2 companies. So histories of supply chain attacks have been out there. 2 of the more well-known brands, perhaps, at least for an American like me, Home Depot, Target, are also suffered these. So they're happening, and 430% increase last year alone. Ransomware has a 97% increase last year. You can see how many reported attacks there were, $20 billion US last year alone, paid off in ransomware. That's not an official, never be an official number, but that's what has been reported. One of the biggest attacks last year, I don't know if anyone's heard about the Colonial Pipeline attack in April, right? Energy sector, US suffered a supply chain attack to its infrastructure. The largest attack within ransomware ever led to Joe Biden actually putting together the executive order on cyber a month later after he became elected. That was the first real thing he could kill, right? So politicians help. Politicians are there to help us. And this is a good example of actually a government official helping in this fight we have. I showed you this slide already about the Internet of vulnerable things. Talked about it already, but Maybe it's kind of strange numbers. What does it really mean? So what we're looking at here is a fish tank, obviously. Again, 2 years ago, a casino in the US was hacked by a thermostat in a fish tank. The hacker hacked the thermostat in the fish tank to hack the whole casino's corporate network, took out all the high roller data, took out all the data about everything that's happening in every base, took it out to the cloud, it was gone. So most of the attacks are quite simplistic, as we've heard from Kim, but there are companies and even states that are not so simple and can figure out ways in the networks. And even as we heard on your network, it wasn't a very advanced attack. This probably wasn't either a very advanced attack. If you have a vulnerability in a product, it's an easy attack. So how are we fighting back? I talked about politicians helping us. This is global legislation in the world. Everything you see in green, it has some kind of cyber or data protection or data privacy legislation in the books. Some of the stuff in red, it might take longer, but maybe they'll get there someday, right? So that's a good thing. We should give a hand to people helping us in the political arena. The stuff we're most familiar with, obviously, is the EU. This thing actually points pretty well. General data protection, most people in Europe know about it because if you're a European citizen, it's there to protect your data and protect your privacy. Wherever you are in the world, with every company using your data and gathering data about you, they can actually be prosecuted if they do something bad with that data. And we'll come into what the implications of what that can mean today. But so in places like the US with Biden and Mexico and South America, and actually Singapore, 2016 was the first one in the world to actually have legislation. So governments are maturing in how they actually deal with this stuff. And GDPR 2018 is really pushing the limits and driving the conversation, which is great. So as I said, it's there to protect privacy, protect data of private individuals. What happens if you don't follow or if you're non-compliant with their policies? Ask British Airways or Marriott here, right? So they paid over 20 million each in euros because they were non-compliant. So those two cases alone are now cited by 30% of businesses why it's important that end customers think about cybersecurity when they building a system and when they procure a system. And they don't just base decisions based on price. What does the camera cost? Or what does the network servers cost? They need to think beyond it, which is a good thing. So if we look at the components of any system, we talk again about the OBDEPS picture of life cycle. You have four main different components in a system. IT stuff is devices, software, infrastructure, architecture. That's all the IT stuff, technology stuff. But then you have people and policies, processes and operations. People actually need to work with this stuff in day to day. Any system has these common components. And how do you deal with them over time to mitigate threats? So when you design a system, when you build a system, step one is to do an assessment of words like probability, risk, negative impact. So probability means something could happen or it might not happen. You need to figure out on your scale of 1 to 10, is it going to happen or not? And then if it happens, what's the negative impact? Is it low or is it high? On my city, on my hospital, on my enterprise business. This is what you need to do when you're doing an assessment and building a system. And most companies do this. They think about it up until they deploy it. But then things happen, because this is not a theoretical world we live in. So if we talk about time as a parameter, I use those same four types of components. I talk about a vulnerable device, I have a new user, make changes to my infrastructure, doing something that I wasn't originally designed to do, or if I want to just upgrade firmware, what happens over time? So I have an acceptable risk for vulnerabilities in terms of my devices, but then I don't do anything with them. I just deploy it and do nothing. That vulnerability is going to raise over time, and it's going to take a long time to actually harden that device again. It's not going to happen overnight, even with a company as good as like a company like Axis, even a very mature company. It takes time to fix a device. New users are another aspect of the system, right? So you get new people coming in, they're not really sure how they use the system. It's going to be risks. Good thing is you can probably reach out to them quite efficiently and mitigate that risk back down to a level that's acceptable quite well. So while people are 95% of the problem, they are very preventable in actually helping them manage the system. We have a system, we want to interchange it, so it's originally doing cameras, it's originally doing sensing stuff, but now we want to add on, let's say, access control, so people can come in and out of city areas or doors or buildings. The original system wasn't really designed to do that. How do they integrate? How well those integrations between these different components actually working? And I'm changing that. I'm building the system so it can do more, so my city can do more. Again, risks keep coming up because the integrations of the different companies probably aren't necessarily tested 100% that they're going to work in reality, which is why a place like H22, where people are actually testing stuff, is a great base for all this. But again, it's a system, and this is technology, so you can harden it. Once you figure out what to do, you get the teams together, you harden it. They'll solve it, bring it down to acceptable level. It's going to take some time, probably not much as one device, but you know, if you're attacked, you're attacked. And then it's the same with firmware. So if you don't upgrade firmware, obviously your risks for vulnerabilities increase. The good news is that you can bring it back down to acceptable levels. So time is a parameter here, which changes. You can't build a static system because 66% of all breaches are based on human error and policy, right? This is IBM has been saying this. That number is actually up to, back to 2014, goes up to 90%. Now they're down to 66%, but it's the majority of all attacks. So this means that people need to be responsible for the system on the end customer side. They need to be quite technical. They need to be quite advanced in how they're using the system, how they're deploying the system, how they're maintaining the system. You need someone responsible for things like ensuring there are best practices and that they're being followed for how to work with the system. You also need policies. So what's the best policy, for example, for user access privileges, people actually coming into the system? How should that be? Have it defined, right? We talked about the control rods at Chernobyl. Those weren't followed. I think a lot of places, they deploy something, they don't really document how should it be used. And then it gets blamed on the users, obviously, because they're the human errors and they're the ones who need to know what to do when something happens. So if something happens, you need to be clear to them how to deal with it. So people and operations are very part of a system, right? I've talked about that. I've talked about supply chain, and the importance, obviously, is you can't just evaluate based on price. You need to evaluate vendors on other things, like what kind of product development processes do they have? What kind of technology features do they have? How are they working with vulnerability management? So how open and transparent of a company are they to actually work with? Can you trust them? So I'm going to go through a bit here what we do with access in this life cycle, right? So we develop a product, we manufacture a product, we distribute it through logistics, we have help system integrators deploy it or installers deploy it. Someone needs to maintain it. That's not us usually. And then the product is either decommissioned or recommissioned, comes off the market or gets updated. So some of the things we do, we've talked about, we saw a DevOps cycle before. Access is in the same game. So a lot of the companies out there who have a more mature product and development manufacturing process, they're trying to deliver security by design. So it's built in to the devices they deliver. So they're doing risk assessment, data privacy assessments already in the requirements phase. They're doing threat modeling during design, code analysis constantly in implementation, and then they're doing external pen testing where they're actually trying to hack the product or paying people to hack the product. So Axis does this. I don't know how many products we have, lots of products. All of them have a bit of firmware software in them. This is applying this model to everything that comes out. I can't say that's true for every company in the security industry, but I do know that's true for our company, which is, I think, is a good strength. So we often talk about cameras and features of cameras, but this is a big feature behind all those features. So if I talk about distribution and logistics, some of the security features we built into our products to make them secure by design is the firmware from the vendor. So here we have Axis signed firmware. It will not accept any tampered firmware. Point and simple. So we've already manufactured it, now we're developing it to the market. The second part is it's secure by default. And here we have secure boot. So it'll only boot authorized firmware that is clean and doesn't have any malware, and is clean after a factory default. These are all features we have in our products these days. And there's another one, but I can't click it. There. How do I know that I'm actually communicating with an authorized device? And this is where Axis Edge Vault comes in. Cryptographic certificates that securely perform operations as certificates on that device. I'll come into what that means a bit less technically here in a second. But these are all things we do to supply, some of the things we do to supply the distribution and logistics of our products after we manufacture them and then trying to bring them out to market. I wanted to go over, now I want to deploy something. I got a camera, I picked it up from the hardware, and I want to put it up in the city, I want to put it up in an enterprise, I want to put it up in a gas station, wherever. How do I know that the platform can be trusted? And this is where we have a TPM module that is using these certificates and keys, and we're going to come into an example of it here in just a second. But these are also features within our cameras these days. Two of the new things we're doing are kind of a combination. So how do I prove the origin of the device? And how do I know that the video has not been tampered with? Someone has not gone in and actually changed the voiceover, changed the image of the video. So Axis has a new offering called Axis Sign Video in this. I'm going to go through what that is in just a second. That is based on Axis device ID. Here in Sweden, we talk about bank ID. I guess they have them in Denmark as well. It's the same sort of thinking, if you know what bank ID is, for authenticating yourself. And then within deployment and maintenance, we have what's called Axis Device Manager and Axis Device Manager Extend, which lets you have control of all of the devices you've ever deployed on your site, on all your sites. You can update firmware, you can update all sorts of stuff. We'll come into that quickly as well. But if I come back to the signed video, right? So it's a cryptographic checksum on each frame of the video together with the Axis Device ID. So I know this device and this video has come together. And then it puts, you have to excuse my lame looking camera here, but the video stream comes in there, the checksum is added, and at the end of it, I get both marks on there. I know what the device ID is, and I know what the signed video has been checked. Mitigating that it's tamper-proof. Axis is an open company. This technology we've released as an open source project. Any camera manufacturer in the world can actually use this, right? So we want to do this to improve security of the security industry as total. Obviously, we want to do it with our own devices, but if we take a context of a city where you have more than just Axis cameras, it's important that everyone tries to lift the game from a vendor standpoint. And this is one example of that from Axis. Then I talked about Axis Device Manager. So what you see here is a dashboard. You're a system integrator. You've deployed a bunch of stuff, a bunch of different sites. Let's say you have 5 sites, 5,000 different devices. I get a dashboard of what's red, obviously, is I need to pay attention to it because maybe the firmware is bad, maybe it's not hardened, maybe someone's gone in and changed some settings that are critical, maybe it has some policies that are not proper. This is the tool that lets you do it all, right? So just a quick, this video is really hard to talk around, but I'm in a site, I have 13 different schools, right? And now I want to be able to apply a security control that I can design myself. I want to disable SSH and FTP in this case. So there I go into all the settings. I come up with the creative name, disable SSH and FTP. This is my policy. And I press save. And then we saw before, it's saving on the software here. And this is one of my sites. All the cameras connected to that site. One click. I press the policy, press save. That's deployed on all those cameras and all those schools. So this is the way companies like Axis need to work together with system integrators, with the installers, one of the ways we do, to help them maintain that devices can be controlled in a good way, in a city context or any other context. I talked about you can also upgrade firmware in there. Again, Axis doesn't in charge of updating firmware, but we have 2 release tracks for that. One is the active track, where with all of our innovation that comes out quite regularly, you can update your firmware. Or if you're a bit more reluctant to do it all the time, we have the long-term track. It's important to notice we also have a 5-year warranty for all our cameras that come out now. So we're in for the long haul. Our cameras go out for 10, 15 years. We're there to support them, which is what the next, not the next slide, a couple slides more we'll talk about. I talked about within maintenance, it's important to know how transparent are your vendors. Can you trust them? Can you talk to them? So vulnerabilities are a big thing in cameras, obviously. 68% of all devices I talked about before on the internet have some kind of vulnerability, known vulnerability. We list on our website all of our products and all of our services status on every vulnerability that we've ever heard about. So in the little black area here, this is 2 of our product offerings in the video management software context and the vulnerabilities that we've known about and how we resolve them. You can click on there and go deeper. And rather than you having to search for that information, you can sign up to vulnerability notifications. We'll send them to you. As soon as we hear about anything, we'll send you updates. So we try to be very transparent. We know where the evolution of all this is, and we know we need to work together with our channel partners and technology partners. So I talked about 5 years, and then if we talk about decommissioning, taking things when it's end of life or end of support, we're actually there as well to talk about responsibility. So this was a quick run through of all the different, not all, but most of the key things we do within a lifecycle approach. And why is that important? Because in a city context, if we want to have all these connected endpoints, the point isn't that we want to have a bunch of devices out there, it's we want to improve citizen services. We want to make safer cities safer. We want to help cities officials be able to gather the data, make real-time decisions, data-driven decisions on how to make their cities and citizens safer. That requires good, secure data protection and cybersecurity, and it requires open, transparent communications, because as I talked about at the beginning of this with Chernobyl, those same risk factors are there for Chernobyl as they are for any IT system. Human error, 95% of the time. They're following often policies and procedures that are not really built for modern systems anymore. And a lot of the time when people buy a system, from a technology perspective, they're thinking very focused on price and getting it deployed, and not the 10 to 15 years after it's deployed. And that is a mentality that takes time to shift, but we're getting there slowly and surely, I'm assuming. So the one big thing, cybersecurity is preventable. Chernobyl was preventable. Attacks are preventable. 95% of the most common attacks, according to IBM, are listed right here. So procurement, talked about it lots of times already. When you're talking to evaluating a vendor for a new system components to that, talk to them not just about when you deploy it, but how you're going to maintain it over time. Have clear roles, policies, and procedures in your organization to make sure that you're actually dealing with it in a hands-on way. Don't just outsource it to a vendor. Use strong passwords. We heard about Kim talking about passwords before. This is still one of the main vectors out there, right? And don't share your passwords. Even if you have a security system, you don't share your passwords. So I don't share my password with my wife, and I recommend you don't either, or your husband. Don't open suspect emails or access requests through apps. So we have a thing in Teams now called, or in Microsoft called Teams, that also people can access documents. Don't open that stuff, especially weird looking emails. Keep firmware and software up to date. That's obvious. Don't expose stuff to the internet if you don't need to. Keep it isolated, but then again, you need to manage it when it is isolated because it needs to be updated. There'll be users on it. So you need to control that interaction in a good way. And then don't use default settings. So my presentation here was more directed towards end customers. I know there's not so many end customers here. I hope I haven't been too high or too low on this, but thanks for your time. I don't know if anyone does anyone have any questions? We can either take them, I can take this microphone off and we can just talk. Mary, what do you say we should do? We're done. Everyone can go home. If we have any questions or we're just wrapping up. They got heavy fun. Yeah. Yeah, so GDPR even works in the US, right? In its own way, a convoluted way. It's not just a European thing. Thanks for today.